Welcome to XYPN Radio, where your host Alan Moore brings you into a community of fee-only financial planners who want to profitably and successfully serve Gen X and Gen Y clients. If you're ready to get the knowledge you need from leaders in your field, learn from forward-thinking advisors, and take action on your own goals, XYPN Radio is the show for you. Here's your host.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of XYPN Radio. I'm your host, Alan Moore, and thank you so much for being on today. Today's episode is an interview with Will Kaplan, who is the founder of Halcyon Financial Planning, which is a firm based out of Oregon. And I completely forgot in the episode to ask him where that name came from. So we'll have to do that inside our VIP community. Will has a really interesting background. You know, his focus in school was more on the psychology side of things and kind of ended up getting into financial planning. But he went through a few various positions before ultimately becoming a firm owner. I think a lot of listeners will resonate with his story. You know, he was a part of a firm that ultimately fell apart. Kind of the partnership broke up, and he watched it really just implode from the inside and saw kind of the messy details of what can go wrong inside of partnerships. He ended up in a partnership style arrangement himself that looked great on paper, but turned out to be a bit of a mess before finally kind of going solo. But you'll hear him talk about that having his name on the wall really wasn't his goal. He wasn't in it for firm ownership. He really wanted to do the work that he wanted to do and couldn't find a firm to give him that opportunity. So he created it for himself. And finally, he's actually in the process of buying another practice from an older advisor and sees that as a huge opportunity going forward. So he has some really valuable ideas to share there. As always, you can access the show notes and additional resources that we mentioned on the episode at xyplanningnetwork.com/37. Also, remember to join our VIP community at xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP. Without further ado, here's my interview with Will. Hey, Will, welcome to the show, man. Thanks so much for being on.
Alan, thank you. I'm really looking forward to the opportunity.
So, Will, you are the first ever nominated guest on XYPN Radio. We were doing a town hall for XYPN members, which you do about once a quarter, kind of an update on the network. And I put out a call to say, hey, if anybody has a cool story, something cool to tell, like, you know, let me know. And another member emailed me and said, you have to have on Will Kaplan. I want to hear his story. So thank you for heeding the call to come on.
Thank you. No, so, I mean, obviously that, I feel like the pressure's on now, but I'll do what I can. Love the network.
It means you have something, you better have something interesting to say. I remember that I was awarded this thing from Wealth Management. It was 10 to watch in 2015, and it was awarded at the end of 2014. And I was like, crap, I've got to do something interesting now.
Right.
Like, I had planned to sit back a little bit. So apparently I'm not allowed to. So I don't know if I accomplished that or not, but we'll see. Listeners can tell us if we accomplish the bring Will on the show and dazzle us with brilliance.
Right. There we go.
So as always, just to, I guess, with these types of interviews, love to go back in time and just learn about your career path. So did you get your degree in financial planning? Did you always know you wanted to be a financial planner? I mean, how did you kind of discover this as your future career?
Sure. So I am I came at this from a very different perspective. I am a liberal arts major. I studied philosophy and sociology at college, and the sociology component was very much social theory. And so it was really like a lot of the things that are here, you know, here's a list of all of the things that are bad about capitalism and why this is destroying our society. And what ended up happening is I ran into a philosophy professor, and I have to give this guy a lot of credit. But he basically said, you know, I'm really glad that you're in this program, and we're excited that you're excited about philosophy. But if you don't go take a whole bunch of economics classes, I'm not going to let you keep going down this philosophy path. And so probably about my sophomore and junior year, I started dabbling in econ. And I found it interesting. I mean, really, this goes back probably even further to where, you know, my father used to come home from work and he would turn on Wall Street Week. And probably, you know, I would say if you're in that sort of Gen X, you probably know what that is. But if you're Gen Y or millennial, you may not even recognize that. But Louis Rukeyser was sort of a massive personality in this particular space. And my dad would watch this. And so early on, I got excited. And I remember at one point saying to my dad, hey, I think we should buy some shares of Intel stock. And this is probably back, I mean, like split adjusted, it would probably be like, you know, 50 cents or something like that. And my dad said, sure, let's do it. Why not? And so we bought like 100 shares or something like that. And it went from whatever it was at the time, I mean, maybe like $20 a share up to $40 a share. And I was like, I'm the smartest person alive. I can do this. And this is actually money. This is great. And that sort of sparked it. And so through my college career, I was, paying attention to what was going on in the market. I mean, I would have like, Yahoo Finance pulled up with the portfolio of stocks that I was interested in watching. And so it stayed on my radar through college. And then leaving college, I ended up moving to the city of Chicago. And there's enough finance going on in Chicago where it was a good opportunity for me to sort of try and jump in. And I ended up going to work for a small RIA that effectively what they were doing, they managed a mutual fund, but then they also had kind of what looked like separately managed accounts today, where it was just, relationships with individual clients, but it was basically replicating the strategy that they were providing inside of the mutual fund. And the nice thing is I was the third person hired by this particular firm. It was really small. When I first went to work there, the mutual fund was managing about 14 million. That's very small.
Yeah, that's tiny.
I mean, it's almost not even on the radar. And by the time I left, they'd sort of broken through the survivability area. I mean, they sort of got the business going and really found their niche and found what they were trying to do. And it resonated with the larger community. And we ended up at 300, 400 million. And it was really fun to be part of that transformative experience. But the other thing was I got to watch the company grow. I got to see some of the needs that a small RA really sort of the places where they suffer. And this is back before CRMs really even existed. And so where I started plugging in here was I ended up basically being the chief technology officer for this really small firm and trying to, run an email server and figure out, the compliance pieces that relate to that. And then also doing the download for Advent and reconciling all those positions and trying to do the trading for the mutual fund. And it was it was just all of it. It was very much the deep end of the pool, but it taught me a lot about sort of the different components of this particular business. And then right about, I ended up stepping away from that firm. The firm still exists. They've grown to probably 15 people at this point. I mean, it's been really neat to sort of watch that evolve. But I ended up deciding that Chicago was not a place that I wanted to raise my family. I felt like it was too big and it was too difficult of an environment. I didn't want to ride a train for 2 hours every day and sort of all the things that go along with being in a big metropolitan area. And so my wife, her career sort of is more limiting than I would say the RIA space. And so we started sort of looking around in different cities along the West Coast. And all of this happened about the same time that tech kind of was melting down. And so state budgets in a lot of these places, which is sort of connected to how my wife's business works, they were just obliterated inside of the state of California. And so that's probably a good reason why I'm not in California, is just because most of the places that were hiring had stopped hiring for my wife's position. And so we ended up in Oregon. And at that point, I really decided I'm sort of interested by this component of technology as it applies to registered investment advisory firms. And I ended up going back to school for a little while and did a little bit of post-bac work in computer science. And while I was doing that, I sort of kept feelers out for different RIAs. And one of them said, hey, we're really looking for somebody to come in and sort of transform our firm in terms of technology and make us more efficient and make us more productive. And then we want that person to transfer from that role into an advisory role. And that was sort of where I got sucked back into the business directly. And I spent probably maybe 2 years at that firm, and we did a tremendous amount of work on the tech side. And then right as I was getting ready to sort of transition, probably 6 months before I was transitioning really into being more on the production side, in terms of working with clients and relationships and things like that, that firm just blew up. The partners got into sort of a disagreement. One partner wanted more control and a better ability to sort of bring new people in and give them ownership as well. And the rest of the partnership didn't want to do it. This particular partner had the majority of the assets and left the firm. And it ended up basically temporarily cratering that firm, where half the staff immediately got let go, myself included. And it was really just something where they didn't have the revenue to continue to sort of keep the thing moving forward. They had to really scale back and sort of rebuild. And going through that process of being at what is they were a decent sized firm. They weren't huge, but it was, several $100 million. And that was probably one of my biggest awakening moments, where I was really able to see sort of some of the darker sides of the industry. Where, as an example, and I'd heard stories about stuff like this, but I never really thought it happened at a place that I was working.
Of course.
What ended up happening is, some of these advisors that had relationships, they had 20, 30, $50 million under management, got called into an office, and basically they said, hey, this is a really tough time. We're going to have to let you go. And by the way, by the time you get back to your desk, your computer doesn't work. Your phone doesn't work. Like, you're totally locked out of the system. And we may decide to go after some of your clients. And it was really eye-opening for me because, I had never been through anything like that. And I think that's much more of a traditional, sort of the old Wall Street model, where the ironic thing is that it's so difficult to do because this is a relationship business. The people that are your clients, you have a relationship with them, they're your friends, you get to know them. Trying to disrupt that and steal that away, I think, is very challenging. And it's really destructive. And so getting to sort of see that happen and not really have it affect me. I mean, I lost the job, but I didn't really have that relationship, and it wasn't directly putting those relationships for me in danger. It was a really quick insight into like, wow, this does happen and it's out there and it's really scary. And I want to be really careful that this never happens to me, because I saw the guys, I was friends with the guys that it happened to, and it was awful. I mean, it really was such a unfortunate situation, because it just doesn't have to go down that way, but in a lot of places it does. And so that was really when I first started thinking about this idea of like, maybe I want more control. Maybe I want to be able to do this on my own. Let me think about this. And I ended up not deciding to do it at that time. I ended up going to work for another firm.
Because what year was this?
Gosh. That's a good question. Let's see. Probably 2010, 2009, maybe something like that. It could have been even earlier. I'm terrible with timelines.
No worries. That just gives us an idea that this was around the bust.
Well, so no. I mean, the bust happened really as we were trying to move to Chicago. I lived or move out of Chicago. I lived here for probably a year or two before I was back into finance, and so it may have. It actually, I mean, going back at the timeline, it may have been earlier than that. It must have been earlier than that.
Okay.
But I mean, it was really eye-opening to sort of see, because Portland is very much a small town, and most of these advisors know a lot of the other advisors in the area, and firms have reputations. And seeing this happen at what felt like a very like, hey, we're all here, we're part of the team. This is how, a win for one of us is a win for all of us. Like, having that transition so quickly into, we're going to have security escort you out of the building, and we're immediately going to be calling all of your clients. Like, it's eye-opening.
And I think it shines a light on, people always used to say, I can't believe you're starting a business that's so risky. And, like you, I was fired. And it was one of those things where it was in that moment of being fired that I realized, no, real risk is giving someone else the ability to control 100% of my income.
Right.
You lose a client and you have 20 clients, you've lost 5% of your income. Okay. And then you can work hard to go get a new client. Somebody that you don't even particularly like potentially owns the control to 100% of your income. And that's it's just a different mentality. I think once you finally do go solo, which we'll talk about, but the definition, and I think our perception of risk as business owners is different than those that haven't ever been through that experience.
Well, and I mean, this sort of leads naturally into I think the next part of my story, which is kind of why I decided to step out on my own. But you're right. I mean, there is risk anywhere in terms of what you're looking to do. And once you sort of make, I think, the connection, I mean, it depends on what type of firm that you worked at previously. Mm-hmm. Some of these firms do a good job of building enterprise value, where the client relationship is really with the firm. It's not with the individual. But that's a newer model. That's not common. Usually it is the advisor and the client. That's the relationship. That's where the value lives. And if the advisor leaves, the client's probably going to leave with them. And now, you see a lot of firms try to combat this with, non-competes and having to purchase those relationships after the fact. And, and I'm friends with some of the people that worked for this firm, and they took clients with them, but now they're still paying that firm for those relationships. And looking back on my career, I feel very lucky that my disruption event occurred prior to getting into the revenue side of the business, where I don't owe anybody anything at this point. Like, the relationships that I have are my relationships.
You make a really good point that people need to pay attention to that hiring packet that they sign, because, where you are the day you get hired from a production and revenue standpoint, and where you are in 3 to 5 years when you're looking at leaving, are very, very different. You do want to be careful because, like you said, you may sign some paperwork that says, that you'll be doing 2x or 3x buyouts or percentage of revenue on an ongoing basis. I mean, I've seen a lot of different things, and yeah, are non-competes non-enforceable in a lot of places? Sure. Do you have the money to pay an attorney to go up against your old firm who has, 100 times the revenue that you do in order to fight it? That's another story. So, to your point, you were fortunate that, and a lot of people make the mistake of signing documents, one, without reading them, and two, without really understanding the long-term implications for themselves.
And honestly, like this touches so many things, because ultimately as financial planners, what I think we're trying to do for a lot of our clients is, you plan for the best. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. You plan for the absolute worst, you hope for the absolute best. And I think that is true whether you're looking at, sort of taking that first position at a larger firm where, you're excited, you're young and you're excited to get a job, and maybe you still have some of that, just naivete of, yeah, this is all going to work out great. Like, I'm going to go in and they're going to hire me and it's going to be fantastic and we're all going to be friends. And maybe you are, maybe you're not. Deciding if you're going to sign that non-compete or not, or figuring out like, okay, these are my relationships and do I want to have to pay you for them as I leave? You have to think about that. And then, I think that also leads into the partnership aspects, where if you're looking to work with other people, what does that entail? It leads into some of the buyout situations where advisors are buying other advisors' firms. So much of this is, hope that things are going to go really well, but what happens if they don't? What do you have to fall back on? And, looking at some of these other advisors that have rolled out of this firm, I mean, it has definitely slowed them down in terms of the disruption, because I think, as we all, know, most of the time clients don't like going through these types of events. They prefer it if it was just a smooth transition and that there's no big deal, but that's rarely the case. And clients that you think are, really strong relationships and, they would never leave me, like a lot of you never know.
You never know. Just a quick story from another advisor that called us whenever they were looking at transitioning out to start their own firm, whenever they told their firm that they were leaving. And they, from all intents and purposes, according to the paperwork, they owned the client relationships. They could leave with their clients. There was no issue. This was set up on the front end. Basically, what the firm did was called and told all of the clients, hey, the advisor's leaving the firm. We can't legally tell you why, but it's not good. That was the message that they called all of their clients with. And of course, they're freaking out, trying to get a firm up and running as quickly as possible. They could transition all their clients, but and I don't want to scare people into like, your boss is going to do something really dirty or shady or anything like that. But you do have to be prepared and understand that this is something that's out there. And while we've had some success stories on this show, such as Justin Rush, that had a very smooth transition where they took their clients with them. If your ultimate goal is to build your own firm, building a firm at someone else's firm and then taking all those clients with you, you got to be careful doing that and just recognize that there is some risk involved there.
Yeah. And honestly, like Justin is a great example of this working out really well. And I'm not sure how far out on the tail he is, because I have not, like in my career and the people that I know, I don't see that story as often. Like, I love that story. Right. And I hope that if someday I'm hiring advisors and they decide that ultimately they don't want to work with me, that I would be that advisor that was with Justin that basically said like, hey, I realize this may not be the place for you, and I'm happy to see you developing your career and successful. So I'm going to try and facilitate that. Like, I'd like to be that advisor, but I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say.
Yeah, my jaw was on the floor when we were talking through, because I know Justin, I thought pretty well. And then whenever we were going through his podcast show, I learned so much. I was just amazed at the advisor that basically facilitated him leaving, whether he had to or not. So again, it's a great story. We hope that, that's the direction that the profession moves, because I think that that's ultimately where we can all be. But it's a good case in point that there's good and bad and ugly of all these situations.
Right.
So you witnessed that situation. You were kind of torn between starting your own firm. It sounds like you took another role at an advisory firm. What was the ultimate deciding factor there between taking a job versus just going solo?
At that point, I really wasn't ready. I hadn't really had client relationships before. And one of the biggest things that I sort of continuously struggle with is the imposter syndrome, and this idea of like, why would anyone hire me to do that?
Mm.
And so at that point, I considered myself still relatively young. And I didn't feel like I had the ability to take on all of it all at once. There wasn't anything like XY at that point.
Sure.
And so, it was very much like, okay, I have to go find an attorney to draw up the documents, and I have to go figure out like, where am I going to custody? And I have no idea where to even begin looking at stuff like that. It was one of those situations where the roadmap wasn't as clearly defined. And there was somebody in town who was like, look, this is how I like to do my planning, and I'm passive, and all of these other things line up, and I'm kind of looking to bring people in. Why don't we give this a shot and we'll just see how it goes? And I said, wow, that seems really easy. Like, I just give you a little bit of my revenue and everything is, simplified. Like, you've got the infrastructure already in place. And I know other people that have sort of taken that same path where the bar of, how do I do this? Like, do I want an LLC? Do I need an S Corp? Do I just do sole prop? Like those types of decisions. And then how do I deal with the compliance component? And, what's an ADV? And just all the stuff that XY.
Books.
Yeah. All the stuff that XY helps facilitate. If you don't have that resource, there's a lot to learn. And I think that, one of the things that I tell clients a lot, prospective clients specifically, is like, financial planning to me is two things. It is the technical knowledge, and then it is sort of the behavioral coaching of like, how do you navigate this system? And I think XY is a good example of, it's a resource for all of the knowledge that XY possesses is available out there on the internet. You can go find all of this information. But where XY really brings tremendous benefit and tremendous value is, it's going to speed that up. You're going to have all these other people. Now I think, 200 some odd other people that have been through a very similar situation, and they've already kind of figured out like, okay, this part of it is noise. There's some signal over here. I'm going to go pay attention to that signal stuff, and I'm going to try and cut as much of the noise out as possible. Whereas when you're on your own, making that distinction between, where's the knowledge that I need and where's all the distraction, it's so much harder. And so in that regard, I think XY does a really nice job of kind of speeding up that research process and saying like, look, 80% of this is going to apply to you. Yes, your story is going to be a little different. You might have a slightly different fee structure. You might have like a slightly different philosophy, or maybe it just doesn't all line up exactly perfectly. But the big pieces are there and available to you. And we're going to help you just sort of like do A, then do B, and then do C, and you're up and running. And without that, I was very anxious to sort of try and accomplish all of the rest of it at the same time. So long story short, I ended up going, to work with this other person with the idea that like, let's just kind of see how we work together, and then we'll talk, maybe in a couple of years and figure out like, does ownership make sense? Do these other things make sense? And, I was very careful to make sure that I didn't have things like a non-compete, and I didn't have, the clients were absolutely mine, and it was well documented that they were mine, and there wouldn't be any, problem leaving. And so that as I was starting to kind of build my business, I had the ability to, if I wanted to step out, and I would probably still be there, other than a very awkward conversation where, the person that I was working with at the time basically said, came in on a Monday morning and said, well, I really like working together, and I think that, we do a good job together. But in order for me to sort of take this firm to the next level, I think I need to take more of a leadership position in the firm. I need to do a little bit more of the driving. And I said, okay, well, tell me more about what that means to you. And as that conversation sort of unfolded, I was beginning to realize like, maybe this is not the place I thought it was. Maybe this is not what I'm looking for in terms of do I want to buy into this firm, and do I want to become part of this culture? And I said, that's great. Let me think about it, because obviously this is a big change in terms of the dynamic. And, effectively what you're asking for me to do is pay you part of what my income is, and then you tell me what to do. And that seems sort of counterintuitive to me.
Yeah.
So I'm going to think about it. And, a couple of days went by. I was working from home over those days because I didn't really feel like being in the office. And a couple of days later, I started getting these emails, and I got one email at 5:00 at night, basically saying like, hey, I haven't seen you in a couple of days. Just want to make sure everything's going okay. 10 minutes later, I got another email like, hey, I'd really like for you to come in tomorrow. I think that we need to have a conversation. 10 minutes after that, another email. And they just kept getting slightly more and more aggressive. And about the fifth or sixth email, I was like, what is going on here? And I finally picked up the phone and I said, hey, I got all these emails. we've worked together for a while now. Do you really think that I'm out to somehow put your company in danger or that I'm doing something that I shouldn't be doing? I mean, you basically came in and said you're going to change the nature of our relationship. And I'm taking some time to think about that because if I'm going to accept that, I need to be okay with that. But I said, if this is going to be what working for you is like, it's not that attractive. And that's really where I feel like during that conversation is really when I decided I need to make a change. And by this point, XY was on the radar. You guys had either just founded, gone through that process of, I guess, that initial class.
Sure.
Or it was maybe probably even maybe just a couple months after that. And so, I started looking around the Portland area. And by this point in my career, I had pretty strong feelings about the type of planning I wanted to do, the type of investment management that I wanted to do, the different tools that I wanted to use. And I don't know if Portland is unique or if I have a feeling it's probably not, but a lot of the companies that are out here that do this are relatively small and they're just not hiring. I mean, it's like, I have a lifestyle practice. I'm really happy. It's just me. I work when I want to. I don't work when I want to. I'm not looking to bring on employees. And so it was this thing where I knew I really wanted to be passive and I really wanted to focus on planning. I just didn't want it to be sort of a disguise for investment management. And it didn't exist. And so in some ways, I kind of got backed into this corner of, hey, you probably, if you really want to do what you want to do, you're going to need to get something off the ground. And luckily, XY had developed at this point where it was really easy for me to just kind of, start talking. I think either, I don't know if I was talking to you or maybe to Maddie a little bit, or I forget sort of who I was originally talking to, but it was very clear that getting up and getting started and already sort of knowing this is some of the stuff that I want to do and this is how I want to do it and how I want to structure it. Having paid more attention to that, I guess, going, over the previous experiences, I had a sense for what I wanted to create, but I was still missing some of the tools like the compliance portion and just even, here's the steps that you need to accomplish to, get everything ready for your state regulator, stuff like that. That was all available to me. And I was able to just kind of, step in, use the resources that XY had available, get the firm up and going, and then bring clients over. And luckily for me, I had a relationship with TD Ameritrade. My clients were already there. I was able to just roll that across. But even going through that process of, I sort of did this. I did this in probably one of the worst ways you can possibly do this. So if there's a lesson here, it's don't be like Will. But effectively what I did is I made the decision to leave my firm and then start my next firm. And if you can do that the other way around, if you can basically kind of get your firm, you've made the decision that you want to step out on your own, and that's great. But if you can do that while you're still working somewhere and get all the pieces in place, you're going to be in such a better spot. Because I basically went through a couple months where clients were in limbo. They weren't with the new firm and they kind of weren't with the old firm either. And I lost business over it. I mean, I had relationships that basically backed away. And this goes back to this concept of clients really don't like change all that much. It was because there was so much uncertainty, because it was basically waiting to hear back from Oregon. I can't really do anything until I get that, all buttoned up. And I probably shouldn't even be talking to you guys about some of the stuff that maybe we're talking about, but, really just trying to be mindful of, I'm not really an advisor at this point, or at least I'm not an advisor out on my own at this point, but I'm not working for that previous company either. And if you can avoid that, I strongly encourage that you do so.
Yeah, you make a couple really good points here. And one of the things that listeners may not be aware of is if you leave your firm and you are starting a new firm, legally, you cannot hold yourself out as being an investment advisor unless you are a registered investment advisor. So you put yourself in limbo when you're not registered and you're starting a firm and you have to do this dance of I'm starting a firm. I just don't have one yet, but I promise it's coming. Because if you call everybody and say, hey, I have a new firm, and you don't, you have to check this little box whenever you're submitting to the state regulators that says, I've been holding myself out as an investment advisor inappropriately.
And they're not wild about that.
They do not like that checkbox. It's worded a little better than I just did, but I remember having to go through that process and being fortunately did not have to check the box. And so just to pull out a couple points through your story, because your story is fascinating. And I think it's one that resonates, honestly, with a lot of folks that are out there. One is that partnership offer seems to happen more and more, especially with folks like yourself that are kind of interested in starting a firm, but maybe aren't the pure entrepreneurs. And when I say pure entrepreneur, I mean, I guess the definition of entrepreneur is someone who starts a business, but some of us are like wired to want to do that and others are not. And that's not a bad thing. That's not a shot, because ultimately I'm not sure that entrepreneurs like myself are the best at actually running businesses. We're just good at getting them started. But that partnership offer seems to get made all the time, and it's very attractive. I mean, I had it offered. I would say the majority of our members at some point or another have been said, like, come in, there'll be some sort of revenue share, some sort of partnership. They don't seem to work out, and they sound so good. They look so good on paper, and yet they very rarely pan out, I think. And maybe I just, self-selection, I only get the bad stories because those are the ones joining XYPN. But I don't know why. I don't have any answers in terms of why that is, but I will encourage the folks that are out there that are getting those offers to entertain it for sure, but really take a look at it because, just on this show, we've had multiple people that have said that they've tried the partnership thing and it just didn't work out.
I think it's really hard. In a lot of ways, it's taking on the relationships that you experience with a spouse, but not all of them. and there's less of that feeling of like, as an example, I sort of consider that decision to get married as there's kind of no turning back. And the challenge with the partnership is there kind of is that I could still go back on this. And, it's a way out in that I totally agree with you. There are so many of these partnerships that are out there. And I've seen it even from people in the network where they think that like, hey, this looks like a really good opportunity for me. And I feel like I should explore this. And one of the things, there's a couple things that I always tell them is like, hey, I've been in a couple of firms and what I've seen kill those firms is politics. So it's not the revenue, it's not finding clients, it's not any of these other things. It's the politics of partnership that seem to be blowing these companies up. And these are successful companies. This is a real thing. And I was very lucky. There's they haven't been partners for that long, a couple of years now, but there's a firm here in Portland, and they are the best example of a high functioning partnership I have ever seen. It is truly a thing to behold. And one of the things that they told me about was this book called The Partnership Charter. There's a couple of things inside of XY that I very frequently sort of bring up again and again. Like NAPFA membership and, certain topics seem to always be coming out of my mouth. Mm-hmm. And when we get on the topic of partnership, this book is the resource that I always tell people about. And really what it's doing is it's telling people to create an investment policy statement around their partnership and effectively lay out like, here's my expectations. Here's the other partner's expectations. Here's the sort of the things that we're going to be doing in terms of actual work and where the responsibilities lie and sort of, who's going to be responsible for what. You just lay out as much as you possibly can and you get it down on paper. So like all of the partners involved have to have the conversation and have to weigh in. And it's an unbelievable resource. And it really, I look back on it now and I'm like, boy, if this thing had existed in any of these places and if people really took it seriously, I see it as such a benefit because it really helps to facilitate that conversation in the same way that an investment policy statement facilitates the conversation around investing with your client. And it's a phenomenal resource. I really encourage anybody that's whether you're just being hired in and you're maybe on the road to partnership, or if you are an existing firm and considering a partnership, like whatever it is, if working with other people is part of what you expect, this is a good read.
Now, what is the name of the book again?
It's called The Partnership Charter. The
Partnership Charter. Okay, and we'll link to that in the show notes because that's I've never read that, but as somebody who is in a partnership, which I would say is high functioning, these are issues that come up, where it's you start tripping over each other in terms of like two people trying to do the same thing, or neither person picking up the ball because forgot to talk about who was actually responsible for it. So
so it's the author is David Gage, Gage.
David Gage. Okay. Yeah, we'll definitely link to that in the show notes. And one more point in your story that I want to focus on, which I think is of interest to folks that are out there. And that is one of the things in terms of the history of XY Planning Network was that when we got started, it really came out of my study group in many ways of, four of us that had started our own firms or kind of doing similar work. And we just kept having the same questions over and over. And that kind of led to, hey, how do we package this together to help other advisors? The four of us were entrepreneurs. We had gone out, we had done it on our own. We were frustrated that we were doing it on our own. We were kind of coming together. And when we launched XY Planning Network, we thought that would be our core clientele. Our core membership would be the folks that were doing that. And what we have learned is actually something somewhat different. And that is that our membership has started to tilt towards many folks that were in a position similar to you that said, I want to do the type of work that I want to do. I want to kind of create a lifestyle for myself and not feel like I have to work 80-hour weeks, and equity would be great. But ownership was not the driver. It was the work. For me, I just like owning things. I'll admit it's part of what drives me. For many folks, though, that we're seeing join XYPN now, it's that there's a type of work that they want to be doing, and there's really no opportunities in the financial planning space for them to do that type of work. And it's extremely frustrating for them. And ultimately, they end up starting a firm, not because their ultimate desire was firm ownership, but simply because there was just something they couldn't find, and they just had to start it themselves. So for the folks that are out there that are a little frustrated and trying to figure out where you can find the right opportunity, sometimes many of us ended up, creating firms simply because we wanted to create our own opportunities and just couldn't find it somewhere else. So just kind of a random caveat there.
No, I think that's spot on. And I think one of the challenges with this industry just in general is there's a lot of industries out there, and I'll pick on law maybe as an example, or even tax or something like that, where, you come out of college, you have the degree, you go into this sort of junior role, and you start learning the business. And you'll probably transition between a couple different places, and then finally you'll find the place that fits with you, and you'll get kind of into that partnership track. And it seems to work okay for those particular industries, but that doesn't seem to be the way this industry works. First of all, if you're in an RIA and you're fee only, you're in the smaller side of the pond is already shrinking.
Yeah, I think the average number of CFPs in a fee-only RIA is something like 1.8. Like, I think it's actually less than 2, or it's somewhere in the 2 range. So they're tiny.
If you look at total number of financial advisors, people that call themselves financial advisors in the United States, the number that I've heard from NAPFA is around 320,000. Then you roll it through a filter and you pull out the CFPs, you're down to about 70, 75,000, somewhere in that ballpark. And then when inside of the CFP, the people that are saying I'm fee only, they're saying it's about 5,500. And so it is about 2%. It's small.
That's an incredibly small number.
Yeah. And so as we're trying to find, I've had people sort of approach me and say hey, I'm just out of school and I'm wondering how you get started in this business. And I'm like, boy, I'll be honest with you. I have absolutely no idea, because I sent out 15, 20 resumes when I got out of college, and I heard back from one place. And I just got really lucky because they were desperate. And, I think that those types of opportunities are out there. But to your point, I think that there's probably a lot of people that have started firms, not necessarily because they're like, man, I really want to see my name on the wall. It's more like, I kind of want to do this my way, and I don't know how else I'm going to get to do that other than starting my own thing.
Yeah, and I will say the job market, the winds of the marketplace have certainly shifted. We're seeing top candidates out of CFP programs getting 4 and 5 competing job offers. But to your point, it's hard to get in with smaller fee-only RIAs. If they have 2 advisors and they hire you, they just increase capacity, by 50%. And so it's kind of a big deal. So, all right. So you finally ultimately made the decision. You went solo. Now, in kind of the pre-call, we were talking about some things, and you mentioned that in your path now is potential, or maybe not potential, but it's actually happening, purchasing of another firm. So can you talk through what in the world is going on there?
This, I think, is an opportunity that's going to just continue to present itself based on the demographics of what's going on in this industry, where, as we just spoke about, finding that path of, I want to get into financial planning. What do I do? How does that actually work? That's challenging. And so the demographics around our industry is the average age of a CFP, mid-60s. The average age of a NAPFA member, exact same spot, 65, 64, something like that. And these are people that have probably been in business for a while. They've probably made a decent income, and they have some understanding of hey, it's important to actually save some of that income. I see what my clients are doing. That may not be optimal. And so they have the ability, if they want, to retire. And a lot of them do. And the challenge is you don't see it quite as much, but probably, Alan, help me out here, maybe 3-4 years ago, every single conference you went to, every single email you got, it was all about succession planning.
Oh my gosh, was it not so annoying?
It was just, it was the topic.
And it really was for a decade. I think we finally have calmed down about it because people realize there's never going to actually do it. But just inundated with information.
And as you mentioned, people aren't going to do it. I think the problem hasn't really gone away. It's just the fact of okay, we've identified the problem. We don't really know how to fix it. So let's just accept it and we'll move on to the next problem. And I think really ultimately what's going on there is it's this issue of you can do this job past normal retirement age if you want to.
What a great side hustle in retirement.
You can be a 70-year-old CFP.
It's a wonderful annuity. And keeping in mind, I mean, statistically, there are more CFPs over 70 than under 30. Right. So we do have people hanging out into their 70s doing this work.
Right, because you can keep doing it. And so I think what's going on here is if you take that piece and then you take this other piece of, wow, this partnership thing is really hard. And I don't think my story is that rare where you basically get this firm where they're like, hey, we're going to hire in some younger talent and we're going to sort of teach them the business and then we're going to transition them into the next phase. Like where that works, I think is the tail. I don't think that's the nice fat part of the distribution. I think it's more rare that actually works out well. And so couple that with sort of a couple of these other things and this succession issue becomes really challenging. And so for the advisors that are sort of in that, kind of mid 30s to probably mid 40s range, I think there's going to be a lot of these types of deals that are coming up. And ultimately what ended up happening to me is I got approached by another advisor here in town who said, hey, we've kind of talked a little bit and I kind of have a pretty good sense for, what's going on in your practice. And a lot of it seems to line up. We have the same planning philosophy. We have a very similar investment philosophy. Our clients are at the same custodian. Like we're sort of running a similar amount of hand-holding, amount of touch, like a lot of these, I think my clients would like you is effectively what's being said here. And I think most people from that position want to put their clients, they want their clients to have a good experience. They don't want to just sort of release them back out into the wild because there's a good chance that some of them are going to end up at the places that
we loathe.
Well, that we have problems with.
Yeah.
And so it becomes this interesting situation is where like this person wants to retire. They want a good outcome from their clients. They want some kind of a decent outcome for themselves. And yet, as you look around the room, I mean, like as an example, I go to NAPFA events here in Portland. And for a while, I was the youngest guy by about 10 years. And as these people look around the room and like, well, who am I going to sell my practice to? There's not a lot of options.
Right.
And so, I think for a lot of people, in a similar position to myself, there's opportunity here. And so, yeah, this is basically a situation where someone approached me and said, hey, would you be interested in this? And we started talking about it. And I kind of approach it again from this idea of like, well, yes, I'm interested in doing this, but there's some things that we need to talk about in order to sort of make this work out well. And we both may be economically incentivized to make this work well. But let's talk about actually what that means and kind of how this actually works. And as an example, I was having this conversation with another NAPFA advisor recently where she came up and said, hey, I'm thinking about, selling my firm, partnering with someone to eventually sell my firm to them. And I said, okay, well, tell me kind of what you feel like that's going to look like and some of these other things. And we started having the conversation. I said, one of the things that I think you need to recognize is that if you really want this to work as the seller, you need to basically come in and not only tell your clients how wonderful this other person is, but kind of make this person the boss. Because if they're not the boss, if you try to hold on to that control component, ultimately it's going to really jeopardize your deal because a lot of your clients might end up leaving if they don't feel like this is a good transition for them. And it's kind of your job as the seller to make them feel like it's a good transition for them. And she kind of looked at me and was like, I hadn't really thought about that, but I kind of see your point because if I sell this thing and then all the clients leave, I'm going to lose money because there's, usually there's some type of mechanism in the deal where if it just totally goes south, the buyer isn't, completely on the hook for the full value.
Right. They generally have to share in the risk.
There's some type of component there. Now, again, obviously from the seller side, it could be that they sell it to a buyer who's just totally incompetent and not able to run a business and they blow it up anyway. And so it has to sort of be somewhere in the middle there. But that said, I look at it as there's sort of things that you can do to try and help facilitate that transition. And if you're not really committed to that, like if you were saying like, I want to bring someone in, but I still kind of want to run my business, that may not work out that well for you. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But ultimately, you're trying to transition it. You need to be focused on that, on what it takes in order to do that well. And I'm not by any stretch of the imagination trying to say that I have the answers there.
Sure.
I will be the first one to say that I do not have any of the answers there. This is something where I'm definitely looking for additional resources and additional help on how to make this happen and have it be really successful. But I see a lot of opportunity because there's so many advisors out there. I look around NAPFA and I see tons of these sort of, anywhere probably between like 30 and 60, 75 million in terms of the management, what they're actually managing. And they're looking for a way out. And that's a good business for a lot of people. I mean, that's a good way to sort of get a jump start on getting to that sort of successful revenue level.
Yeah, I mean, going from 0 to 10 million is a heck of a lot harder than just buying 40 million.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what resources have you been using? I mean, are there any companies specifically in terms of valuation or financing or anything that you're utilizing?
Yeah, so I got kind of lucky. FP Transitions happens to be here in Portland, and they do a pretty good job of providing valuations. Some of the things that I was sort of eye-opening to me is this idea of what do your clients look like? Do you have just a couple of really big clients? Like let's say, so we'll take my ballpark is about 40 million. Okay. And so let's say 10 million of that is one relationship. That's kind of risky.
Yeah.
I mean, that's 25% of the revenue. If that's one relationship and they leave, they don't like this deal, that could be problematic. And so when you start looking at it from somebody that's actually experienced doing these valuations, they'll say, oh, we might want to put a discount on that. And then as another place where you might be looking for a discount, well, what if all the clients are 80 years old? How long are they going to be around? Maybe not that long. Maybe that's another discount. And so getting the valuation right, I think, is important for both parties. I definitely would recommend people, look at some of these, firms that specialize in this because there's little things like that we don't necessarily consider right off the bat. I mean, the industry has the multiple that they like to attach to, how much revenue, great, slap a multiple on that, and that's the valuation of the firm.
Yep.
But I think it's a little bit more nuanced than what that actually looks like. And so we went through the process of at least getting the valuation through FP Transitions. Turns out they don't really like to help structure these deals unless they're larger. My understanding is they're typically looking at stuff for over 100 million.
Sure, that makes sense.
Which I totally get, but at least having the valuation component, sort of getting them to help with the valuation component is beneficial. And it's not cheap, but it's something that I think is probably worthwhile in taking a look at.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really interesting point around the valuations because most people have heard 2x revenue is, what your firm's worth. If you make $500,000, then you sell it for $1 million on some sort of note. But, there's so many nuances. Like you said, the aging client base. The flip side is what if you were personally selling your firm and your average client age is 42 and you have recurring planning revenue plus some AUM? Like I would say that's worth a heck of a lot more than, a book of 80-year-old clients, even if it's the same revenue. So it's an interesting piece that getting expert help is highly recommended.
Well, and not only that, but I think that the concept of enterprise value, whether it is, are those relationships actually with the firm or are they with the individual? There's benefit if they're with the firm. I think there's benefit if you have a really good infrastructure in terms of efficiency where, I'm trying to build a firm where I can basically take myself out of the seat that I'm in and have the company still run. And that's worth something very different than you've got somebody that basically the whole thing just revolves around them. They're the deal maker. They know where all the bodies are buried and they sort of know all the secrets and they're the only ones that can make this thing work. That's a different valuation too. And so I think it's just important to make sure that you sort of account for as many of those things as you can. And really, honestly, what you're looking at, I think more than anything is just the experience of having done it a couple hundred times.
Right.
And that's where I see the benefit of using, somebody that does this professionally.
Yeah. And that's where, again, you can learn everything you need to know online. There's ebooks, there's, a blog post, you can interview other advisors that have gone through it. But ultimately, I am obviously a fan of experts. I think that's why clients hire us to be their financial planners is because we get to take all the noise and synthesize it down. WebMD did not replace the doctor. Google and its infinite wisdom has not replaced the financial advisor. And I think that transition consultants are extremely valuable as well. So do you mind if we ask, are you doing kind of an internal note or are you going to finance the purchase of?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about that. So the way that the individual that I'm, working with, the person on the other side of this transaction really wants to manage how they recognize value from the transition. And I think the challenge here, I mean, like, I can see where they're coming from because, I started my company and I threw a couple $1,000s together and I'm kind of off the ground and running. And then if I go to sell this thing, and let's say that I'm really lucky and I sell it, maybe at some point I get to that point where I'm $500,000 of revenue. That'd be great. And so I'm looking at this $1 million valuation on my company. That's all capital gain.
That's a good point.
Because I have almost no basis in this thing. And so the challenge that I think, in my particular situation, the advisor that I'm working with, they want to minimize that if they can. And they want to try and recognize the value of the firm through earned income that they can defer. And so effectively, I'm coming up with not a modest, some of it is coming in as a down payment. And they'll just recognize that as probably capital gain. But then the rest of it is basically they're becoming an employee of my firm. And we're very closely managing what their salary is going to look like in order that they can take advantage of various things that are on his radar. But then also he doesn't actually want this income. And so his plan is to defer as much of it as he possibly can. And so we'll probably end up opening a 401k, and effectively what I'm paying him will just go into the 401k in terms of, instead of it becoming, a capital gain or however else people usually structure it, he just wants it, tucked away in a qualified account. And I can see the benefit there. And also he's willing to take a little bit of a cut in terms of what maybe the valuation actually could be, because I'm willing to be flexible, and effectively what he would be paying off in taxes, he's kind of able to keep some of that. And so it is somewhat mutually beneficial.
In the back of my mind, my CFP training is screaming, why take ordinary income as salary when you could get capital gains, or why not,
right?
Or roll this into another investment, something. But hey, I'm assuming he's a smart guy. He built a successful firm. He's figured out that from a tax perspective, that's what's best for him.
So he's a CFP and a CPA as well. And really what he's trying to do is he recognizes that he's got to sort of take some of this in somehow. And effectively, we're going to try and manage it to a level where he will end up in a his tax bracket is not really going to be that challenging.
Gotcha.
And by being able to defer it, he's, ultimately the way that I kind of look at this when I'm doing planning for clients is the best situation, you never pay tax.
Sure.
Second best situation, pay tax at some point in the future and just hope that tax bracket is close to what it was like today. And then, the least optimal probably is just pay all the tax now. And so ultimately, I think what he's looking at is if he can sort of push his income down enough and then defer as much of it as he possibly can, that this will end up benefiting him as opposed to just a capital gain. I mean, I get it. I mean, I appreciate the concept of a capital gain too. I think it's just the idea that, if I was looking at that and I basically had, 20% on $1 million, that's a decent sized number. And so, exploring at least other opportunities might be worth it.
Yeah, and I'll say, I think there are a lot of ways to do this. We had Jake Keebler on in our first week of episodes. I think he was episode 6 or 7, and he did kind of an internal buy. You're doing this with more of a salary, salary with deferral. We had one of our vendors at the XY Planning Network conference last year, and maybe we'll have them on the show at some point, was Live Oak Bank, who does M&A and buyout of RIAs financing. So they're doing the financing for all of these deals.
Right.
I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. You can actually be really, really creative. There's no single way, because people will say like, okay, well, how do I buy a firm? It's like, okay, come on.
Well, and even as an example, I think we've seen some stuff on the forums just recently where other advisors are sort of chiming in and saying like, here's a breakdown of this particular model favors this particular individual in the transaction, and here's why you might want to do it. And then here's sort of the other side of it and who it favors and kind of what to watch out for. So, there are some resources available even inside of XY around this, because there are some people that have either gone through it or have sort of tinkered with it enough to do some research on it. But yeah, I think that's one of the really interesting things about this is that there are so many different ways to sort of attack this that, like a lot of the financial planning, it's not really about here's the answer. It's about here's a couple of answers. Let's try and figure out which one you want to go forward with.
Which is really where it's advantageous to have somebody who has done this for a ton of different firms instead of just, those of us that have maybe done it once. I transitioned out, obviously, so I've been on the seller side of things, but I've only done it once, and I've done it the way that made sense for me, not necessarily the way that made sense for 100 different advisors.
Right.
So, gosh, your story is fascinating because it's really amazing the path that we all took to end up in this place of firm ownership. I mean, it's
my gosh. It's so random. Like, I look back on it, and I think that one of the biggest things that I've sort of taken away from it over the years is, and I try and share this in the network too, is there will be times when it really seems like the walls are closing in and you feel trapped and you're like in a horrible spot, and you end up somehow moving forward. And then as you get past it, you're able to look back and I remember the day that I got fired from this particular firm that sort of blew up because of the partnership issue. And I'm driving home and I'm thinking to myself, like, well, this is just the worst. This is a horrible feeling. I'm so, upset about being in this particular position. And now I look back on it and I'm like, thank goodness I'm not working there, because I'm able to see how dangerous it could have been to get into that position, as opposed to sort of where I am now, where I feel like I have more control and I'm doing more of what I actually want to be doing. And I'm not giving away as much of a giant chunk of my revenue. And it's one of those things where, like, as you're transitioning through a lot of these processes, it feels like it is just, wow, I've really messed something up, or, this is the wrong path. I don't know how I ended up here. And it's really hard to evaluate that when you're in the middle of it. I think once you get past it, you can look back and maybe be a little bit more objective and realize, like, boy, I could have ended up there and I'm so lucky I didn't. And that's now how I look back on it. Whereas at the time, it was just exactly the opposite. I was thinking to myself, like, boy, this is really a disaster. Like, I've got, a 1-year-old at home. My income is now gone. I have to go figure out, like, where am I going to find the next job? The market may be good. It may be bad. Like, who knows what's going on with the market? And so many RIAs are just strictly tied to AUM, and they're facing, like, well, 30% of our revenue is gone this year. We're certainly not hiring. You never really know what the next opportunity is going to bring. And that has been presented to me sort of continuously throughout my career, of feeling like, I cannot believe I got myself into this mess, only to realize it was kind of like, actually, you just kind of dodged a bullet there, but you didn't realize it at the time.
Yeah, I would say it's amazing to be able to go back and connect the dots, and on one of these shows, I'll end up kind of telling my story. And it's funny, kind of the same way with you. You don't realize just how important each step of the process is until you go back and look at it and say, like, this is how all of it was connected. But, and we could all end up, who knows, in different situations, but it's all about, my encouragement to advisors is, take the risk, be willing to make the leap, chase the opportunities, because they don't come around again, and you just never know where they'll lead.
And not only that, but I mean, you're going to get sort of smacked in the face, and you just have to keep going. You can't stop. And, I forget what the exact expression is, but there's the thing like, what is wisdom? Well, like, it's experience, or however this particular thing goes. And, like, how do you get experience through, like, bad decisions, or it's some combination of those things. And I forget exactly what it is. So I'm going to sound like an idiot when I listen to this again. But, ultimately it's this idea, like, some of the best ways that we learn is sort of getting ourselves into trouble and then figuring out how to get ourselves out of trouble.
Yep.
And, I know in my career, I've definitely had those places where I feel like, man, I'm really in trouble. I need to figure a way out. But then also, this is not a business where you just sort of, you open your doors and you say, okay, clients, come find me. And it's just smooth sailing. I mean, this is like constantly, having to do course corrections and having to figure out, what am I doing right and what am I doing wrong? And that's really, for me, that's one of the big benefits of XY, is I've got now like 200 other people that are sort of in this same situation that I can go to and say, like, I don't feel like I know how to move forward here. And chances are somebody else is going to say, oh, I had that happen to me. This is what I did. This is how it didn't work. Definitely don't do that. You get sort of that shared experience. And I think that's really one of the bigger benefits from the network, is just that there are people that are so willing to share and sort of, step out and say, oh yeah, I have experience with that. Let me tell you how it works. Or, oh yeah, I had experience with that, and this was total disaster. Don't do this. That's really, that's value, because we don't all know everything. And I think the biggest value is just understanding what it is that you don't know everything, really what that means, and being willing to sort of say, I need help with this, and having something like XY where you've got that resource for people that'll, come step up and say, like, let me help you with that. Here's how to do that. that's really what we all need.
We call it choosing your own coworkers because, to your point, no one can know everything, but it is very rare, I think, that we come across situations that someone out of the 200 members hasn't experienced. And it's all about, for us, protecting the culture of sharing and collaboration. And for the most part, pretty much any member of the network will give you the shirt off their back to help. And they'll jump on the phone with you for an hour and talk through a situation. And it really is amazing to see. It's certainly the core benefit. It's not why people join, but I think it's why they stay. Will, thank you so very much for taking the time to be on. I am extremely thankful that the other member nominated you to be on. We're going to put out more calls because, sometimes y'all are interacting with each other and I miss out on the cool stories. And so it's just awesome to be able to tap into just experience and just kind of what you're going through and what you're working on. Because I think ultimately it's just extremely valuable for listeners to hear of a path that they probably very well can connect with.
Well, honestly, it's my pleasure. I mean, hopefully whoever wanted this information is going to get something out of it. I mean, to me, it's sort of I consider it's not that big of a deal
because it's you, but
because it's me. It's just that's the way it is. But no, I am happy to share it, and I think that really is, as you mentioned, that's one of the big values in the network is that there are so many people that are just willing to really, jump in and say, I'm happy to help you, and that's not something you find everywhere. And so that's really a credit, I think, to what you guys have built with XY. So it's my pleasure to do stuff like that.
Well, thank you. Well, and who knows, we may have to have you on the show again to talk through once you actually go through the buying process to kind of talk through that, because I think that'll be fascinating. But thank you again for taking the time.
Alan, it's my pleasure.
Will is an extremely active member in the XYPN community, as you can tell. And I think his story really tells the tale of some things that are really wrong in our industry and really how young planners are overcoming some pretty significant hurdles to find and build their own great life. Now, remember to join our VIP community to be able to ask our members, Will, other guests, Kitsis and I questions, as well as interact with other members of the VIP community and get their perspectives at xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP. Thanks again for joining me today. We'll see you next time.
You're not alone and you're not crazy. It's scary starting, building, and growing your own financial planning firm. And that's why we put together a free private community just for you, the Cutting Edge Financial Planner. Go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP or text XYPN Radio to 33344 and join a network of thousands ready to change the lives of Gen X and Gen Y clients.